Good evening and welcome to this digitally enabled special meeting of the Council of the Municipality of North Perth held on Monday, May 31st, 2021. I'm Mayor Todd Kasenberg and I'll call this meeting to order. I ask the clerk or deputy clerk to note our starting time for the minutes as 7 p.m. Colleagues, I want to call at this time for a special moment of silence to show our concern and sympathy to the families dealing with the horrible find of 215 children's remains at the residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. I invite your brief participation. Thank you very much. Today's meeting is being streamed live on the Municipality of North Perth YouTube channel and will be available there after the meeting as an archived video. Anyone who is invited to speak will be recorded and their voice, image, and comments will form part of the live stream. The chair and/or the clerk have the discretion and authority at any time to direct the termination or interruption of live streaming. Such direction will only be given in exceptional circumstances when deemed relevant. Circumstances may include instances where the content of debate or discussion is considered misleading, defamatory, or potentially inappropriate to be published. Thank you very much. Welcome to those who are joining us via the YouTube channels. Welcome to councillors, staff, and delegations. We have some special guests, invited guests tonight who will participate in this special meeting. At this time, I invite your decorum. Over the course of the coming meeting, I have had news just ahead of the meeting that Councillor Johnston may or may not be in attendance tonight. Clerk Bearfelds, do we see him at this hour? We're not seeing him yet. I know that he's busy with farming duties. Let us move to item 1.1 on our agenda pertaining to pecuniary interest. For the benefit of those unfamiliar with our council practices, provincial legislation requires councillors with a potential pecuniary or financial interest in any item at the council table to declare this interest and to remove her or himself from discussions and voting on the item. In accordance with recommended protocol at this time, I invite all councillors with pecuniary interest, including those who have declared in writing, to verbally advise the chair in public session and to submit documentation to that effect in writing to the clerk. Councillors are further reminded that should a potential conflict arise during the meeting, they may so declare and act at any point in the meeting. Councillors, we haven't heard in advance from any of you. Does anyone wish at this time to declare a potential conflict of pecuniary interest? We're not seeing any, so that allows us to move forward. There won't be a lot of motions tonight, Council. I want to explain briefly, as always, our virtual processes. Where we have opportunities to vote, I will reach out to some of you to serve as movers and seconders of the resolutions that are put before us. I'll do this to the degree feasible, although as I said, there won't be many, alphabetically. And should you not wish to respond to the request, just let us know and I'll move on to the next name on the alphabetical list. Again, there will be opportunities for you to speak. Usual rules apply here, although we're not being quite as formal, so I shouldn't say usual rules apply. It's a little bit more relaxed environment this evening because we're having some guests and significant discussion. So we will watch speaking order as usual, and I would like to describe how some of this will unfold shortly. If I don't think I'm hearing you, if we think that we've lost your audio, I'll let you know. We ask you to maintain that mute state until it's time for you to speak and you've been called upon. We're not using eScribe tonight, which is our voting software, but a manual voting process will be used. We don't believe there'll be too many resolutions, as I've already said, but during a vote, I will call, as is my custom, for those who are opposed. If you are opposed, you may so indicate in the chat function. We'll deduct those negative votes from the total of all those in attendance tonight, and if there is a majority opposed, we'll also declare that. I just want to sort of go over what we think the process is going to look like tonight. We are going to receive some information from our guests this evening about ward boundaries, electoral process, and council composition. We are then going to have CAO Snell share some information, a little bit preliminary perhaps, about the council compensation review that has been commissioned. And then what I'd like to do is sort of open the floor to some questions to seek more information or opinion from the experts assembled. I'd rather reserve our opinions until a critical point in our meeting, which I'll explain. I propose, probably after our information seeking, to do a straw poll of council to see where you stand with regards to the recommendation that the clerk has made in her report at that point, and then we'll figure out how to proceed from that point, because it's a rather important piece of insight to help us direct the conversation one way or the other with regards to what we do after that. Following that straw poll, then we'll unfold a little bit of a process, whichever feels right to our meeting aims. And at that point, every councillor will have an opportunity to express opinions and share their own perspective, the perspective of their constituents, should they wish, and we'll proceed something like that. So we're going to have our speeches, our presentations first, then we'll have questions session, then we'll do a straw poll, and then we'll decide how we proceed with the remainder of the discussion about electoral process reform in North Perth at that point. So that's how I propose we proceed in terms of procedures tonight. At this time, then, what we need to do is approve our agenda. I have that simple resolution that the agenda for tonight's meeting as amended be approved. Is there an amendment that we need to make note of? Okay, so maybe take out those words, if that's all right, Clerk Berfels. Okay. So the agenda for tonight's meeting be approved. Can I call on Councillor Richardson to serve as our mover for this one?
Yes, Mayor Kasenberg, I'll make that motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Anstedt, will you serve as our seconder?
Yes, I would second that motion. Thank you.
Thanks. Any discussion or debate on this one? Right. Are there any opposed? Perfels, are we seeing anything? Okay, so council has granted its consent to the agenda. Thank you. At this time, we do not have delegations that are scheduled or presentations that are scheduled under item 3 on our agenda as shown, but we do have reports with guest presentations. And at this time, I'm going to have the clerk invite or introduce our guests, sorry. These guests are going to address items 4.1.1 and 4.1.2. Following their remarks, as I've already indicated, we'll call on CAO Snell to make some comments and follow up, and then we'll turn to the question session. So I'm going to turn the floor over briefly to Clerk Berfels so she can introduce our guests appropriately and welcome them to our meeting. Clerk Berfels, let me just set this up.
Good evening, Council. Tonight it is my pleasure to have invited Jack Amendolia and Dr. Robert Williams to provide some ideas and suggestions regarding maybe a potential need for a ward boundary review with revisions to the electoral process for the municipality of North Perth. At this committee meeting and noted in my report, tonight I was hoping for an open discussion and an opportunity to share opinions and ideas. Our guests are here to listen to your thoughts, provide some guidance, and answer some questions. Based on Council's direction at our previous meeting on April 26, I did reach out to Watson and Associates for some assistance. The reason for that is that they've already played a very big part in the role of the county official plan review, and also have a very good understanding and history of the municipality of North Perth. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Jack. Jack is a managing partner for Watson and Associates Economics Limited. His sector there is education. However, As stated, he was strongly recommended through Watson and Associates to assist me. And Jack's sector is actually education, and he does specialize in school board planning and the study of school age demographics, including facility and capital planning, education development, and pupil accommodation reviews. Now, basically what I've understand as well is that Jack has played a role in some of the reviews of our local school boards here in North Perth. As well, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert Williams. Mr. Williams' specialty has been in Canadian municipal government and politics. Mr. Williams has been an active member of the Department of Political Science from 1971 until his retirement at the end of 2006. Where in his retirement, Dr. Williams has been engaged independently or with Watsons and Associates to conduct or advise on ward boundary and electoral system reviews in more than 25 Ontario municipalities. He has even testified as an expert witness before the Ontario Municipal Board in several cases involving electoral arrangements. So tonight I would now like to pass it over to our guests and ask the gentleman to provide North Perth Council with a brief explanation of their involvement with ward boundary reviews with several municipalities in Ontario.
Great. I'd like to thank the clerk for that introduction and thank the mayor and council for inviting us here to speak to you about some council composition and ward boundary issues and topics. So thank you very much. In terms of a little bit about what we do and who we are, so the clerk touched on it already a little bit, but I'll get into a couple of more details to provide some context. So Watson and Associates has been around for a few decades now. A lot of the work we do is with Ontario municipalities primarily, but we work across Canada as well. And we do things such as the clerk mentioned, official plan reviews, development charges, fiscal impacts. A lot of it is rooted in knowing the population and knowing the demographics and knowing how those places are going to grow. And that's really a big part in what we do with regard to ward boundary reviews, is we provide that technical expertise. We know the municipalities well, we know the councils well from a lot of the other work we do. We understand those communities, like I said, how those settlements are going to change and grow. And that's an integral part of any ward boundary review. We'll talk a little bit tonight, I'm sure, about how we use guiding principles and case law to really help frame the methodology and the process that we use in the ward boundary review. And one of those important guiding principles that I'm sure everyone has heard of, even if you don't know a lot about ward boundary reviews, is representation by population, or rep by pop. And like I said, that's really where Watson's strength lies in these processes. In terms of how the Watson-Dr. Williams relationship evolved, so Watson has been doing ward boundary reviews for well over a decade, if not longer, prior to 2008. And Gary Scanlon, a partner at Watson, dabbled, I think is fair to say, in ward boundary reviews before 2008. As the clerk mentioned, and I'll let Dr. Williams sort of describe himself and introduce himself, but he was working on ward boundary reviews as well independently. A relationship formed around 2007, 2008 between Watson and Dr. Williams, really bringing the different skill sets that you need in a ward boundary review process together. Again, the strengths for Watson, the municipal understanding and the population. And as you'll learn when Dr. Williams tells you a little bit about himself, there's other guiding principles that are important, such as communities of interest, such as ensuring that the ward boundary lines are clear and identifiable. So it's really trying to combine these guiding principles to form a good ward boundary review process and ultimately get your residents effective representation. That's what we're really trying to do through this process by meeting those other guiding principles. In terms of some of the work we're doing right now, I mean, Bob and I, or Dr. Williams, I'm gonna start calling him Bob because that's the way he's gonna ask you to refer to him much more informally. So Bob and Watson, I mean, since we've been together in 2008, we've kind of lost count of how many ward boundary reviews we've done together. We think it's probably upwards of 30 or so now. Just in this last round, in the last 2 years, we've completed or currently in the process of working on, I think, about 14 or 15 right now. So it's been, practically double what we did in the decade before, just in the last year and a half, 2 years. So it's becoming, I think, just as and I think similar to your situation, as we approach about 2 decades, 25 years in some cases after amalgamation, municipalities are starting to say, okay, does this still fit? We were kind of slapped together many years ago based on these pre-amalgamation boundaries. Does it still make sense? And they're starting to ask those questions. So ward boundary reviews, council composition is definitely becoming, I think, more prevalent in Ontario in general. So again, that's a little bit about me, a little bit about Watson and the relationship that Watson and Dr. Williams has. But I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Williams now, and he can tell you a little bit about himself and a little bit more about the process that we've started to develop with regard to these reviews. Bob?
There we are. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Thank you. Got a little flustered there. All right. Thank you, Jack. The discussion that we wanted to bring to you covers a lot of ground, and it's important that we think a little bit about where we're coming from. As Jack indicated, I have been working with Watson and at some point independently, but mostly with Watson over the course of the last 10 years or so on reviews that have emerged across Ontario in varying sizes, if I can put it that way. We've worked in large communities like Oshawa and Hamilton, intermediate sized places like Barrie, Aurelia, Pickering, and then down into smaller municipalities in the current round, places like Oro-Medonte or Cavan Monaghan and a few other places. So our expertise is looking at trying to approach the system to fit the community itself. Now, the process that we use and we've developed, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, we've worked together to create a process that we believe is a very successful approach to looking at electoral systems. And the reason we have to do that is that, in fact, the legislation, the Ontario Municipal Act, doesn't say anything about that. It simply gives a municipal council, broadly speaking, two powers. One, to change the composition of the council, that is how big it is, and that's all it says. You can do it, nothing more. And then beyond that, questions about how you're going to elect those people. And in the case of the municipalities, it involves electing members of council at large, or what's called a general vote system, in wards, or some kind of a combination. But again, there's nothing beyond that. No are appropriate, how many there should be, what kinds of factors you need to take into account. So what we bring to this process is some direction, some recommendations about how all of that will work in any municipality, whether it be large, intermediate, or small. So what we're bringing to this exercise is based on experience, based on the research and practices that are found elsewhere in Ontario, and using those as a way to adapt to the circumstance of, in this case, of North Perth. So what we try to do is as I said, as Jack indicated, we work together. Watson and Associates can provide some of the information that we might need. I try to come at it from the point of view of other components, what we're referring to as some guiding principles. And again, the legislation doesn't say a ward system must be A, B, C, and D, and it meets principles 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are the things that we bring to it, and we apply as rigorously as we can in designing and recommending appropriate ward structures. Maybe make one last comment too, Jack, before I turn it back. Our starting point is the system you've got now. what does it look like? Where did it come from? What are the main attributes, strengths, weaknesses of that system? Both the things that we might determine, but also what your community might tell you. And this is part of what we would do as well, some consultation. What does the community think of the system? And we need, of course, to move beyond simply saying, oh, well, that's the system. We're just going to leave it because we all understand it. Our sense is you can have this, you can keep the status quo, but you really need to know why. What does the status quo do for you that some other system could not do? Or what is it about the status quo that you believe should be retained, but at the same time, what could be improved? So our work always starts with what is the system now? Run it through the filters of these principles we've alluded to identify possible modifications that we could then incorporate into some alternatives that we would bring back both to the community and to council to think about, maybe there's another way to do it. I'll stop there for a moment.
I think the other thing I would add to that too, when we talk about some of the guiding principles and even some of the methodologies or what we hear, is it's important for council and the public to understand that there's tensions in those, and even in the guiding principles themselves. For example, typical guiding principles would be, some of the things I talked about, representation by population, considering future population trends, and communities of interest. But a lot of times communities of interest and representation by population may be against each other. And what I mean by that is trying to balance and find a system where you have wards that all have an equal population. You might not be able to achieve perfect communities of interest or vice versa. So those are the types of things when Bob talks about going out and getting and doing public engagement. Those are the types of things that we need to understand so we can cater the process to your municipality. In some places, we hear from 80% of respondents that the wards have to be of equal population. And that's the only thing, or not the only thing, but it has to be a priority. In other places, I'll give Caledon as a municipality we're working in right now, it's very different from what we're hearing from the public there. They have a history of traditional communities and neighborhoods and hamlets, and there's a desire from the public there to see a continuation of that tradition, and they want to see that carried out in the ward system as well. So it's really a matter of us working with your community, and ultimately it's council that has the last word and last say in this, but trying to give you enough options and trying to give you enough information so that you can make that ultimate decision with all that information at your fingertips. But again, like we said, the guiding principles aren't necessarily consistent with each other. So it is important to find out what's important to that specific community. So I think, I mean, that is a general, idea of who we are, what we're doing, a little bit about the process, a methodology, a little bit about the legislation. But like Bob said, there's really not much in terms of guidance there that really resulted in us developing some practices that have been tested and not a lot. Our intention is not to go to OMB and LPAT, but when they have been, that methodology has been tested as well. So I think at this point, if there are specific questions or any discussion points, we're at your disposal, and so ask away.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your orientation to the kind of work that you do and even some of the issues and experience that you have. That's very helpful. What I like to do from a methodological point of view is to get council to focus on a question round first. I think I'm going to call on CAO Snell for a few comments before we go to our question round. So just hold with us, gentlemen, for a little while longer. CAO Snell, did you have some comments or orientation that you'd like to make to this issue?
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council. Certainly, the clerk and I have looked to some experts in this field, so it's certainly Council's opportunity to ask some of the questions that they had even at the initial discussion time of this issue. I guess now is your opportunity to ask those questions. And I guess if council is, after the discussion, if council is satisfied, certainly they can look at receiving a proposals for further work, or the other option is they could go to an RFP. Um, um, just one further update too, as council is well aware, there is a council remuneration review going on at the present time. Current schedule for that review is to come to the Human Resources Committee meeting next Monday night with the draft plan. If that is not required for too much revisions, it will come to hopefully the June 21st council meeting for council to review the process for council remuneration that was done by, as you know, a citizens committee. Certainly can answer any questions that council may have.
Thank you very much, CAO Snell. So why don't we actually roll call questions and see if councillors have questions one by one. I think that might be helpful. Why don't we begin with, let's see here, Councillor Duncan. You get to be our first questioner. If you have questions about any of these matters, please ask them now.
I guess one of my questions is in regard to our current situation in North Perth is most of our population is centered in the Listowel ward currently. We kind of have a unique situation. I'm sure these guys have probably seen it before, where we have some smaller outlying communities and a couple of large rural wards with a large urban population center. And if my thoughts are, if we were to go to an at-large election system, potentially people would not even have to campaign outside that large urban ward to be elected. So I'm just wondering what your experiences with that situation are.
I could jump in there if you like, Councillor. The idea of dissolving the wards, which is the way that action is described in the Municipal Act, is certainly open to you, but it is an arrangement that has a number of benefits and costs, or pluses and minuses, if I can call it that. And I believe there are a few comments of that sort that the clerk has included in one of the documents circulated. We could go on for an hour on that topic alone if you wanted. But the issue really has to do with changing the way choices are made. And by that, I mean, everybody is in the same pool. Every candidate is campaigning to get votes across the whole municipality. But you're going straight to, I think, a very important, let's call it strategic direction. If a candidate wants to get elected, could probably do all the campaigning on foot within Listowel and probably get enough to win a seat, depending on how many seats you've got. And that, while that's part of that structure, it certainly carries other costs, because one of the things that can frequently happen in an at-large election is that a significant number of councillors could live in a very limited part of the municipality, have virtually no contact with any other parts of it, if you will, in the course of campaigning and in the course of serving on council. And I mean, our facetious example is you could end up, and you've got a pretty large council, but you could have 10 councillors. You could have 8 of them living on the same street in Listowel, and nobody from Newry, nobody from Donegal, nobody from Gowanstown, because the numbers are all in that main center. I personally don't believe that it's the right direction to go for a municipality like yours, but if there is a sense that would be helpful, certainly we'd want to consider it. Again, part of the other trade-off too, from the point of view of all of you being part-time councillors, it means if you've got, and I don't have the number, maybe the clerk has it, if your population is, say, 13,000 people, give or take, it means every councillor has got to listen to 13,000 people. Every last one of them would see that person as her or his councillor. So it magnifies the kind of expectation that might go with someone in an at-large system. I recognize that once you swear your oath of office, you're serving the entire municipality. But we know that things like constituency service, for lack of a better word, tends to be focused in your ward. You don't often get contacts from people in other wards. If you have no wards, it means everybody's in the same game. So, the trade-off is, and we hear this a lot, I can vote for anybody. I've got everybody to choose from, but it also means that everybody you pick has got everyone else to respond back to. So I'm going off on some tangents, and I probably am getting more into the pros and cons of it, but it is an option that's there. It's not neutral. It has certain consequences that may not be seen to be desirable when we weigh them all up. And I go back to my earlier point. You need to stop and say, all right, we're doing it in a certain way. What do we like about that? What might we improve? And in what way would having an at-large system bring some of those improvements? Until we actually do some of that digging, I'm not sure I have an answer for it that's definitive. But we have some hints, if you will, from other experiences that we would certainly want to take into account. Jack, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that last part in terms of the councillor's question. It's come up in, I would say pretty much every municipality we work in that has similar populations, or let's say under, 30,000 population. Absolutely, the at-large issue has come up in all the reviews we've done. But in like your municipality, many of those circumstances have been similar in that it's been a largely rural area with one sort of urbanized or one larger urban concentration of population. And it really comes down to some of the cons, I guess, that Bob talked about, where the reality could be that your entire council, again, a little bit cheeky, but it could be that your entire council ends up, coming from the same street. The other thing too that we've talked about in our research we've encountered with some at-large councils, even on the other side of the coin a little bit in some of the larger municipalities, Stratford's an example that has come up in the past, is one thing you could end up with is the number of candidates that actually run for the election can be quite large. So it gets very difficult as a voter to have any kind of recognition or familiarity with the candidates that are running. So you show up and Bob, I think you can remind me, I think it was 20 something.
I know there was at least 28 candidates, either the last election or the one before, for 10 seats.
Right. So it gets very difficult, presented with a list of almost 30 names, some of which you've probably never seen before, and trying to pick 10 of them at a ballot. So again, we find that in those situations, the ward system helps with constituents in terms of recognition and familiarity, and in not only in some of the circumstances Bob mentioned when a councillor actually gets elected, but actually in terms of the election process itself.
Thanks, gents. Councillor Duncan, any other questions? I'll allow you one more.
No, I'm good. Let's move along.
Thank you. Next to Deputy Mayor Kellum.
Yes, thank you, through you, Mayor Kaysenberg and Bob. Thanks for your earlier comments. Learn a few things out of it. With regards to your response to Councillor Duncan, there are some things I agree with, but there are also a few things that I disagree with that we will maybe touch on later. My question is, you said earlier on that you did approximately 30 presentations over the last few years or whatever. I don't want to know which, but can you give me an idea whether it was a municipality switching from the ward to the at-large, or from the at-large to the ward system? What percentage or roughly how many made that switch?
The reality is that we have not dealt with a municipality that has dissolved its wards. They tend to be situations where they basically want to improve them, if I can put it that way. So we're not really very often looking at that fundamental switch. As Jack said, in a few cases, the idea has been promoted either from the community, occasionally from members of council, and we would review its implications for the municipality. In terms of going from at-large to wards, again, we have not had a lot of experiences. Probably the most significant one in all of this would be the city of Oshawa, which we did on the last round, where the city had elected councillors in wards, went to an at-large system, and then moved back and went basically from a clear slate to say, no, it's a lot better if we elect them in wards. So please come and help us do that. So the actual transition from one to the other is not all that common. There are a few of them that occur over the course of any given cycle. And by that, I mean between elections when these have to be done. And most of the time, those changes, I would say, are ones that are driven by particular circumstances. A lot of them have to do with amalgamations where people have been grouped, two places, maybe or three have been put together, and there's a feeling after time that, well, those internal identifications don't really matter anymore. Those are pretty rare. Most of the time, the loyalties that went into it persist for quite a long time. And to be able to say, no, we have none, is an unlikely story. And I'm aware of a couple of cases where those kinds of changes have been appealed. I came across one actually in the last few days where an attempt had been made to eliminate wards and go in, to eliminate an at-large system and go to wards, and it was appealed by a resident, and the board basically said, no, that you're not the kind of community that should be electing everybody at large anymore. Now, granted, this was a place that was getting over 50,000 people, but the process they followed, the rationale that the petitioner brought to say, oh, no, it was good enough. We've always done it that way. Let's just keep it the way it was. Of course, doesn't mesh with the reality of the new community. And again, if you were going to say, let's dissolve the wards, part of the exercise would be to make sure you know why that's appropriate for your community and what it would bring to the residents that the current system doesn't. Again, I sound like I'm preaching. I'm sorry. I don't. We're sort of going right into the heart of it, but I see some real challenges to try to make a case for a change, especially given the kind of community that you have with the one larger urban center, but a number of others. Making that into a single system is something that would really need some careful thought.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your comments. That's all I have, Mayor Todd. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor. Next up is Councillor Richardson.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Kasenberg, and thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. I guess in the past, I've always been a significant proponent of the at-large system, only for the reason is that, and I understand your points that you say, and now that I'm getting a little more educated with your professionalism, I've always found that the only time that there was an actual point of separation between council was at election time. That's when the town of Listowel was brought up, the township of Elma, the township of Wallace. When the only time wards are mentioned independently is at election time, because everything else, and I consider council to be very similar to like a board of directors for a corporation. We're doing the best for the entire municipality, that we've all answered questions from residents, whether it be from Listowel, from Atwood, from Gallenstown, from anywhere, that I've fielded calls from all areas. You make a good point about receiving all the calls, but I certainly, pardon me, I certainly feel that there's possibly merit to it. I will gladly be educated. I will more than happy to be so, but I guess we're just possibly looking for a better way, better representation, even if we keep between the wards. But I honestly think that I was even told when I was first elected to council that from now on, you're making decisions for the greater municipality of North Perth. You're not making decisions for Listowel and I have yet to see really any comments that have come back that have been strictly ward specific on our particular council that have come forward to say this has to be done for Elma, or this has to be done for Listowel, or this has to be done for Wallace. It's sort of like for the greater good. And I'm just thinking with the size of the municipality, I do understand the split. I completely appreciate that. But I'm just wondering, are we really to that size where the wards are of significant benefit? Because everybody knows everybody for the most part.
Will that always be the case, though?
Quite possibly not. And I totally understand that, and I know where you're coming from, but I'm just wondering at what point in time, like obviously we're talking into the future, and I really don't have a particular question, but those have been my thoughts in the past, and I'll be more than happy to be educated, and I will fall on my sword if necessary, but I would certainly be happy to do so.
This doesn't need to be anything quite as critical as that, but one of the other angles to think about here, though, is that the wards are there primarily for electoral purposes. You're right; they're not there to say, okay, we need to put a fire station in that ward because we put one in another ward, or we need to put certain number of snow plows out because it's one ward and not another. It's really about how members of council are to be elected. And there are some things about the system that we would encourage you to think about. And that's part of Jack's point about what is it based on? The reality is it's based on history. It's based on a history that is receding in the minds of many people, especially as your community grows. And it's not to say that there is no value in having a community history or a community connection. But when it comes to making your choice for an election or at an election time, there may be other things that we need to take into account. Just to take a different example based on what we're looking at, one of the goals that we are trying to promote is the idea of equity, fairness. It's a key part of an important court decision related to electoral boundaries in Canada, the idea of effective representation. But that in turn is triggered by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which talks about equality. And there's a little wrinkle in your system that I'm just going to throw out there and we can come back to. If you happen to live in Listowel, you get to vote for the mayor and the deputy mayor and 3 members of council, right? If you live in Wallace, you only get to vote for 2. You, as an individual voter, have less influence than somebody who happens to live in Listowel. That's not, to me, that's not treating people equally. It is a bias that gives some members of the community more influence than others. It's a factor that is inherent in the way that ward system was originally structured, which basically said, let's just take the 3 parts. We won't touch those boundaries, but we'll give them different numbers of seats. What the net effect is, some people have more influence than others. It's a factor that we think you should at least think about. Is this perpetuating a form of inequity across the system? And there are ways of addressing that, of course, by moving away from the kind of wards that you're talking about to some where every ward, let's say, elects 1 person. If that means 8 wards, fine. If that means some other, but every ward is the same. It's the same, roughly the same number of people who have a voice. When it's election time, those people get together and govern on behalf of the whole community. But it's how you make that choice that we're want you to at least think about. Is it perpetuating a form of advantage to some members of the community and not others? Jack, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just a couple of things, Bob. And I think some of them are already touched upon. What we're also trying to do is thinking about the system, and we hear a lot about individual counselors, and even this idea of, we've worked in other systems that have had, what I could think of that had 3 counselors, 2 counselors, 1 counselor per ward. And one perspective to look at it is, with 3 counselors, they all have a third of the work and they can divide it amongst themselves semi-equally. But when we get to the practicality of it, often what we've heard in many of the ward boundary reviews is that one of the three might get 90% of the calls because of, again, familiarity or recognition. And again, that counselor might say, but I don't care that I get 90% of the calls. I love it and I can do it. And I've been doing it a long time. And what we're trying to say is we get that it might work really well today. And we get that it might work really well with some of the personalities of council or some of the way individual counselors do their job. But what we're trying to say is, what if those counselors don't run next time? Or what if they don't win? Or what if they're not around next time? We're trying to give options for a system that's going to work in the vacuum of individual personalities, but really focusing more on the system itself. The other part or other reason why that becomes important, and again, I'm thinking of another place we worked in, and I don't have to name the name, but it was similar where the at-large definitely became a consideration for us because we heard it from the public, from some members of council as well. And this is a place, again, with one real urban center, very similar to yours, and experiencing extreme growth over the last several years and expected to going forward. And when we started to look at where the growth is coming from, it's coming from the GTA. It's coming from a diverse background of newcomers. And they might not have the same familiarity, same tradition, same knowledge of some of the historic hamlets and communities and counselors for that matter. So again, when there's a place that's growing and changing, we're trying to provide options for the system that, regardless of what familiarity or history you have, you still have effective representation available to you, regardless, I think, of your individual circumstances. So I think those are just a couple of things that we're trying to touch on as well, or not even that we're trying to touch on, but we're trying to create a process, I think, to give councils options that highlight some of those issues.
Thanks. Councillor Richardson, one more question, or are you good to go?
I'm okay. Thank you so much for the comments, gentlemen.
Thanks. Next up, and we're still sticking with questions, Councillor Rothwell.
Thanks very much, Mayor Todd. Thank you, Bob and Jack. It's nice to see you again in our work previously. Just one item here. So I had mentioned in our previous meeting, the Township of Perth South, prior to the last municipal election, did dissolve their ward boundaries. Now they're far different. They're a population of 4,400, and they're two former townships, which are very much similar. But that at least is the only one that I'm aware of in Perth County that made the change to dissolve the wards, just for an FYI. Bob, I want to pick up on a comment that you had regarding equity for voters and so on. And I see this as a bit of a challenge when we talk about representation by population and how we deal with having an appropriate number of councillors represent, say, for example, the Listowel ward, which, based on the report, has had 5,700 electors in our last election. Elma had 2,600 approximately, and Wallace had 1,500 voters, electors there. So the question I have in my mind is that when you raise the issue of equity for the voter, how does that stand when we're talking about representation by population for the entire council? I'd just like to hear your comment on that. Thank you.
Well, again, without knowing all of the stories that go into the current boundaries, and part of our review is to talk to people like you and the members of the community. What I'm getting at, and I don't want to sound like I'm jeopardizing the whole exercise, you got to get away from thinking about these are the only 3 wards. Because that's what Jack was suggesting earlier. If you say those 3 wards are the only way to think about your community, then you're clashing with this idea of population parity that we're just talking about. You're treating people differently if you say the only way to do it is to keep those historic boundaries. The reality might have to be it's not a single Listowel ward. Maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, I don't know. But you're basically saying we move beyond having to shoehorn everything into the boundaries that are 150 years old. And there's a place for that, though, that history. There's a place to have those identities, But to run a fair and equitable electoral system, you sometimes have to say, okay, we now have to move outside these boundaries that were created for a different purpose at a different time with a different complex of or different distribution of population. So what it may sound like is that we want to come in and break the whole system up. That's not really what we're after. We're trying to say, let's regroup the communities, the neighborhoods, whatever we want to call them, into units that are roughly similar in size. That's going to be a challenge, of course, because if we're looking at Wallace Township, yes, it's going to take a lot of territory to get to the same number of people that you could get in a quarter of Listowel. That's part of where these principles come in. What is a fair way to do that? Can you push it to some fixed number, or could you in fact say, no, okay, a ward that covers Wallace is going to look different because it is sparsely populated, thinly populated, as opposed to one that may include part of Listowel. This is where we're moving away from saying it's only 3, and that if you're saying it's only 3, then basically you're limiting what you can do to address equity, as far as I'm concerned. And that's part of what all we ever do is make a recommendation. We say, here's a different way to do it. Think about it. Think about where you are now as opposed to where you were when your municipality was created, and where your community is going to be in 10 years, roughly, say after a third election. Is it going to look like this? Is the population, probably because of various provincial regulations and others, we know growth is going to be concentrated in certain areas. And is that going to spill over from the nice, neat little square that you've got now that's called Listowel? And if so, then you're changing the communities that are there, and you have to step back and say, maybe we need to draw that in a different way. Again, to try to come back to some kind of, the term we would call is population parity. Not exactly parity, but some more relative parity than you've got in your current distribution of electors, which is significantly different. Jack, you want to jump in on some of that, please?
Just, what you touched on at the end there, Bob, is that even when we're talking about population parity, we typically use a variance of 25% from the optimal population, just to account for some of those things that, excuse me, finding, being able to divide, and again, whatever that number is, 3, 5, 8, being able to divide a municipality into perfect quadrants or perfect, equal wards is practically impossible. But we have those other guiding, so we have 2 things. We have the variance that helps us say it doesn't have to be exactly. We have that 25% we can play with. But then we want to balance that with the other guiding principles. And the community of interest one is a good one, especially in your circumstances, that we're not going to usually, and some options, this is what some of the wards look like, but we're typically not going to draw a circle around Listowel, divide it into 7, and say, okay, the rest of North Perth gets 1 seat based on or whatever that is based on population. We want to consider, obviously population parity, but we want to consider all of these other guiding principles as well. So oftentimes you'll see a system that we design that the urban wards have very good population parity, but we suspend population parity for if we have 2 or 3 rural wards. We say, you know what? We're not going to be able to achieve perfect parity, because if we did, you would lose, 3 seats would become 1, or you would have this giant ward where, again, trying to think of the practicality of the exercise too, you might have a ward where it takes a councillor 3 hours to drive to 2 constituents' residences, and that's not practical either. So that's really, we want to have population parity, but you want to balance it with the other guiding principle. And like I said, that variance helps us have some flexibility as well.
Thanks. Let me just jump in for one moment. Jack, we're having a real hard time hearing you. Your volume is very, very low compared to the average volume of the other speakers. I don't know if you need to play with your microphone, but we're all struggling to hear you, and councillors are raising that issue as well.
I'll see what I can do. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rothwell, one more question.
My last question is whether Bob or Jack, do you actually look at the size of council and prepare those recommendations? And is that done in conjunction with our study, which our CEO Chris Nell talked about in terms of the compensation review? Or is this your review solely on the basis of looking at wards or
Yeah.
not? Thank you.
I'll ask Jack to start with that one if you don't mind, Jack. No.
Can everyone hear me a little bit better?
It's a bit better.
Okay. Try to get a little closer. So yeah, it really depends on what the municipality asks us to look at. So we do some reviews that are only ward boundary. So we don't want to look at composition. We don't want to look at part-time versus full-time. We only want to look at a redesign of our existing wards. In other cases, we look at it all, where we look at ward boundary, we look at composition, we've looked at election versus selection of deputy mayor. Bob is involved in a study in Guelph where they've literally looked at part-time versus full-time and remuneration and number. So it really depends. I mean, we're able to do, again, just the simple ward boundary review exercise, or we can do, the full 9 yard, the anything that involved, like I said, composition to remuneration to ward boundary.
Yeah, let me start with that too, that it's really as much a matter of what council wants to look at. The total number of members on your council, it's like the other, there's no rules. The province just says, you decide how big it is. As long as you've got 5 members and one of them is elected at large to become what it's called the head of council. And I guess in Perth County, you've also got the idea of a deputy mayor. So if you follow that, you've got a head of council, a deputy mayor, and you only have to have 3 to meet the threshold. You can go as far as you want after that. And you've gone to a level where you've got these 8 ward councillors. That's not a number that's carved in stone or built in brick or whatever it is. It's a number that you were given at amalgamation, which was thought to be acceptable in the light of the grouping that you put together to create North Perth. It could change at any point. And if you, as a council, say, gee, we're handling the workload with 10 of us, 2 of us at large and 8 in wards, and that's great, then fine. If we were to be asked to do this, we would start with that assumption. 8 members elected in wards. What kind of ways could you do that? 2 members in 4 wards, 8 members in 1 ward, some other arrangement. I will be a little bit cheeky and say I'm not likely to recommend different numbers in different wards for reasons that I've talked about. But if your direction is to say we only want to look at how the councillors are elected and not at the number, that's fine. We would then work through that. Or if it were a case of saying we think we should have a different number, give us some research, give us some insight, ask the community, should we get smaller, should we get bigger? Again, that would be part of the evaluation. Is that the right number? Again, the province doesn't tell you anything. I will mention that you could do that, at your next meeting if you wanted to change the number and keep the same wards, because changing the number is not open to appeal. A change under Section 217 to reduce your council, let's say from a mayor and a deputy mayor and 8 councillors to some other number, that's not open to appeal. Now, once you change the boundaries, it is. And you obviously want to mesh them together. But as Jack suggested, if there is interest in a review of both, we are doing some where we consider both. In other cases, council has said, we've got, what did we have in Whitchurch, Jack? 7 wards, wasn't it? It's anyway, we've got 7 wards, give us 7 new wards. Fine, that's all we do. And they move forward with that. There have been a lot of debates going on in Simcoe County over the role of a deputy mayor, and we've alluded to that before. In the end, they had a long discussion and decided not to make a change. But there were possibilities of having to reduce the representation on the county council, and that would ripple back through the size of the council. So, for example, if you were to have if you didn't need a deputy mayor on a county council, what do? Do you create another ward, or do you just simply cut your number by one, or something of that sort? We've wrestled with some of those. In the end, county council didn't change, and we had to work with it. I'll take the other side. Jack mentioned it before. Caledon, the town of Caledon, had 4 seats on Peel Regional Council, and I'll be a little cheeky here. Brampton stole 2 of them, so they were down to 2 regional council seats. So what do we do now, folks? Do we just absorb the loss and keep reduce the size of our council, or do we replace them to keep council the same size? Big debate. And we try to come up with scenarios to say, here's what you might think about to either replace those people, because it's not going to cost you any more because you're already paying them, or to do something else. So again, the story is complicated. We don't directly get involved in how much councillors get paid. That, I think you've got a process underway, and I think that's the normal one. The Guelph one is a little unusual because Guelph has basically said, should we pay our councillors as if they are full-time, which is a different kind of practice. We don't know what they're going to choose, but it's really a case of saying, how many does it take to run a city of that size in this environment? Is it better to have, and our recommendation will be going to them in a couple of weeks, is it better to have 8 full-time councillors elected in 8 wards, or to keep 12 councillors elected in 6 wards who are part-time? It's not a clear-cut answer, but the discussion we would contribute to that discussion. Okay, I'm off on a tangent, so bear with me.
The other thing I would add to that too is sometimes we're asked to only do a ward boundary review. However, we have come up with recommendations that have dealt with council composition. And the reason why it relates back to the guiding principles is that let's say that we're dealing in a place that has 3 wards, and when we go to redesign the wards, it might not be possible to achieve effective representation or the guiding principles with 3. So we have made recommendations in the past where we have said, okay, here's your 3 ward redesign. We don't think you're achieving what we want to, but we think you can with 4 or with 5 or with 6. It may have been outside our scope, but again, we either came across that conclusion, or in another case, it was raised many times through public engagement. So it wasn't part of our scope, but often we heard again and again through the public, why is council this size? Have they considered going larger? So to address that, we came up with some options that looked at larger. In another place, in Vaughan, I can name the place because it's been in the news and it's public information. We were specifically asked not to look at council composition. Council was very direct in their orders to us. And now, as we're reaching the conclusion stage of this process, many in the public have said our council should be larger, and it's become a pretty big issue now. So we weren't asked to look at it, but it has come up, and the public has relayed that through the engagement process to their council. But again, in that case, we were told absolutely not. We're not going to consider anything larger than the number of councillors that we have. So it varies based on the scope, but sometimes even if it's outside of our scope, we may come back to council, because again, if we heard it from the public and we didn't tell you about it, then we're not being transparent and we're not doing our job.
And there are certainly sometimes cases where people want a smaller council. Members of council themselves sometimes want a smaller council, although that becomes a little more difficult looking across the council table at colleagues and say, we don't want all of you here next time. I'm being again facetious, but in the case of is this the right size for a community of your population, of your geography, the workload, whatever, could you get along with fewer? Maybe you can. That could also be part of a direction, let's say, that might come out of a contract or a proposal or whatever that would initiate a ward boundary review. Look at the possibility of fewer. And again, as Jack has suggested, very often there is a sense from the community, and it may not be strictly local. I mean, it's part of a bigger, let's call it perspective out there in the community that, and you've heard this before, there are too many politicians. We don't want as many politicians. Again, you'd want to think about, well, all right, what would that mean for the capacity to represent your municipality if there were fewer, in terms of how many wards and so forth, and what would the workload impact be if there were fewer people to play that role? The simple answer, Councillor, of course, is that we deal with all of these depending on the circumstances in the given community, and that's part of what would be part of a discussion to set up a review that we might conduct. What all do you want considered in that exercise?
Thank you.
I will turn again. We're still in the fact-seeking and information-gathering stage here. Councillor Seiler, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor Todd. I've heard a lot of comments here and whatnot. There's been some good talk here tonight, and I know my comment is that the one thing I hear all the time is that people want to vote for who's ever representing them and making decisions on council as a ratepayer. And you also hear, well, such a certain councillor voted against my thing in council, and I can't even vote for him. And so we got to make a level playing field here somehow. And my question to you two gentlemen is, if you were to do something for us on a review, do you reach out to the public?
Yeah, I can start this one. So yeah, public engagement is a integral component, I would say, of all the studies that we do. It's always been an important component pre-COVID, but I would say that post-COVID it's become even more robust because we've had to, because we don't have the same avenues available to us. Having an open session at a community center where people can come in and walk in, we've had to engage more aggressively, I think is the best term to use. So it's really caused us to think out of the box in terms of how we reach people for a ward boundary or council composition review. So we do things now like quizzes that we release to the community, just to, for example, we do a how well do you know North Perth quiz, where you start filling it out and you don't even know you're doing a ward boundary review quiz until you get to sort of question 7 or 8, really just to raise awareness in the community about these types of studies. We do surveys, both online and paper copies. We do information sessions, open house sessions to come and learn more about the process and get feedback. Lots of information on the website, different discussion papers and information papers. So it is really important. And what we're clear with the public and with council is that it's not a popularity contest. It's not, if the public in a survey votes 82% for option 1, that's the one we're going forward with. What we're clear is that it's important feedback for the consultants and ultimately council to take all of the different information that we provide in conjunction with data and in conjunction with consultant recommendations and case law. It's one component of the process, but again, an important one because we want to ensure that we hear from the public, but more importantly, we want council to ensure that when we come to you with options, that they have been vetted through the public and you have an idea of what those preferences are. Bob?
Yeah, I was going to add, one of the parts of the legislation, again, that's missing is that there is no requirement. This is not something that must go to some kind of a referendum or that you can't make a change unless you've had a vote. No reference to that in there at all. There's no formal requirement for consultation. It used to be before amendments to the Municipal Act, I believe in 2006, there was a requirement that a public meeting be held before a ward boundary bylaw was passed by council. That's not there anymore either. In fact, nowadays you just have to tell every people after you've passed the bylaw that it happened. But our process, and again, we talked about this early on, what we bring to a review of this kind, as Jack suggested, is a robust consultation process that has now, of course, changed because of COVID, but would always be consistent with what your municipality already does. We wouldn't walk in and say, here's how you do it. Our approach would be to say, all right, North Perth, how do you normally consult with your community? Let's work to bring that about in a way that people are familiar with, people are comfortable with. And if we need to innovate, as we had to do in the last year and a half, then we work that innovation with municipal staff to be compatible with what works in your community. And you know, if the issues of broadband are a problem, then we need to find a way to get the word out in let's say old-fashioned means. We might have to use newspapers. We might have to do some other technique. But our goal is there's two parts of it. One is education, which is part of what I hope we're doing tonight, recognizing that you don't just take a map and a marker and draw a couple of lines and that's it. There's more to it than that to come up with a good system. So we talk to people about some of the kinds of things we're talking about tonight. Well, why would you do that? Why do we need to take this or that into account? And then secondly, to do that in a way that gives us useful, as we'll call it, feedback. It's a bit of a mushy word, but it helps us understand the community. It helps us pick up on the kinds of comments that we've just heard about, well, I can't vote for that person or I can't vote against that person because of the system. Well, why can't you? What would we have to do to make that happen? What would you gain and lose if that was part of a new system? Again, that's a process that we would normally cover in at least 2 rounds early on, gathering information about the current system. Again, what works, what might be changed, what's the nature of the community. Take all that information, come back with some ideas. We often refer to them as preliminary options. Okay, we've heard the community. Here are some other ideas. Yeah, you've got your current one. Here are some things about that we've heard that people like and don't like, but here are a couple of other ways. So tell us about those. And that becomes something we can also build on, where we might say, oops, well, we didn't get that one right, but here's another one that we can amend and modify and perhaps accomplish some of those things. So it's a process that, as I said, is an important, although it's not mandatory, it's important. I think it's also fair to say that in the end, if a bylaw were passed either to eliminate wards or to change the wards, and that bylaw was appealed, LPAT would want to be very clear that there has been a full and let's call it robust consultation process. This is not council simply slipping in a change behind everybody's back. It has had a process that would stand up to scrutiny, and that's certainly an important part of what we would want to see happen in this situation.
Thank you, gentlemen. Councillor Seiler, do you have another question, or shall I move on?
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you. Councillor Andreessen is next. Questions?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank our guests for sharing your expertise. It's been very helpful, and I'm very much appreciating, you know, educating us for sure. The is really related to the uniqueness of our
Leanne, you're cutting out really badly.
you know, mentioned already.
Leanne,
This comes question. What if I write question in the chat?
It's a good idea.
That's fine, because you're breaking up really badly.
Can I write my question?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
I suppose I could sing the Jeopardy song at this point. Leanne, maybe what we'll do is we'll move to Councillor Anstead. Oh, there we go. There's a question. So let's go with Leanne's question. Gentlemen, the question reads, how would you change the ward system to reach equity with the rural and urban uniqueness of this community? And I think maybe we're putting too much on these gentlemen at this point in time, because that's the proposition, that we engage them for the purposes of figuring that out for us. And I think we shared some of the principles they would use. But gentlemen, if you have brief comments on this, I'd appreciate you wrapping up my thinking on that.
I'll try to be brief then. Part of the point is a trade-off or a balancing off of some of those principles. Presumably a rural area would, with a less population, would have to be larger in size, but not unreasonable. So we'd have to find a way to get some kind of approximate population parity without making wards that are too large in a geographic sense. And that's part of the balancing act that we would need to try to develop. And I couldn't say at the outset how that might work in North Perth, where those lines might have to be drawn to get some degree of parity. Again, as Jack mentioned, we've got a fair bit of flexibility. So that really is the crux of what we would want to do, because we need to serve all parts of it in an electoral system, not just the urban interest and not just the rural interest.
Thanks, Jack. Do you have anything to contribute there?
No, I would leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Deanna, I'm going to jump next to Neil. Councillor Anstead, I know you've had a question for a while, so finally.
Yeah, and I apologize, Mayor Kasenberg. I wasn't aware we were going around the horn, so thank you very much. Through you, Mayor Kasenberg, and thanks, Dr. Williams, for coming this evening. I previously took one of your classes way back when, so it's nice to see you again. I was just wondering if you could touch briefly on the, sorry, can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we have you, Neil. Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I thought I was breaking up there. I was just wondering, Dr. Williams, if you could touch briefly on voter turnout and participation on the ward system versus at-large systems. I know previously Dr. Aaron Moore in 2017 wrote a paper on electoral reform in Canada, and I think it touched briefly on that, but I was just wondering if I could get a little bit of your insights on that matter. Thank you.
Well, I haven't done any direct research on this question for sure, so I would not try to pretend to be an expert on it. I think part of the issue would have to be, well, on the broad level, of course, we know municipal turnout is often abysmal. You may be an exception, but I'm not sure about that. But we know it's generally low. My sense would be that the more the system is, I'll call it complicated, the more difficult it is to generate interest. Again, Jack, you're making a reference to Stratford, a long list of 28 people. Who are my top 10? I don't know who they are. I'm picking randomly. And in one case, in a sense, that means people are not prepared to invest in what it takes to learn. And again, that's part of that at-large problem. There's an awful lot of names to learn. In a ward, my sense is that at least it's a bit cleaner. You don't have to sift through. You may have a lot of candidates, but you only have to sift down and pick, in some cases, one or two people. I know you've got a slightly different here. That becomes less of a challenge. Part of the goal is to make it as simple and as straightforward as possible, because municipal elections, again, they're different than other elections. If you go into a polling station at a federal election, you get to make one choice. You go into a municipal polling station, you're making mayor, a deputy mayor, a councillor, or 2 or 3, a school board, or whatever. It takes a lot more to become informed and to make a meaningful choice. And for a lot of people, they just aren't prepared to make that investment. And I think, as I said, a simple system would help that. But we don't have the answer to that. We can make a contribution, but I don't think we have any answer to, one system is definitively better than another. Again, I have a bias.
Jack, anything to add to that one?
No, I think Bob pretty much covered it.
Thank you very much. Neil, another question? One more?
No, that was helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Behrens is next.
Thank you, Mayor Kasenberg, through you. Thank you to our guests. Certainly have enjoyed the conversation so far. Having been one of the, I guess, more senior people on council, I was actually there at amalgamation, and I will say that everything that's been said tonight was talked about back then with representation and the reasons why we do things. So Bob, for the historical significance of it, I do appreciate your comments. I think it's important to remember that probably there isn't really a system in Canada or in the province where you can vote for every single person that makes a decision for your betterment. Certainly not at the federal level, not at the provincial level. And I question, and I know it would probably come into the guiding principles that is that a system that we want to have? I guess what I'm more interested in is how do you approach guidance? I would for every community slightly different. And what's important to one community would be important, like a municipality, I mean, not community, a municipality, what might be important to North Perth versus, Stratford. They could be completely different guiding principles.
Yep.
So is there an exercise in that you would do if engaged to do this work that would be the first thing that would be done? That's my first question.
And my short answer would be yes. One of the first things one would want to do is to work closely with staff to determine the right principles or the best principles for the particular municipality. And they do vary. Some are looking at it from a different perspective. And our role, if we were being invited to do this, would be to work with staff to find out the ones that would be most appropriate. For example, I worked in a project of this kind in Eastern Ontario, where one of the guiding principles specifically said taking account of communities of interest, but also having regard for the rural nature of the municipality. That was a guiding principle, right? We didn't find that in Hamilton. We didn't find that in Oshawa. We didn't find it in Vaughan. But in that municipality, that was something they wanted to have recognized. Again, making it happen is part of the challenge. But our if you will, our point of reference was to say, we were asked to look at that. Population, community of interest, topographical features, sometimes that matters a lot more than others. Probably, as long as you've got clean boundary lines, I don't think you'd need to bring into things like topographical features. But again, slightly tongue-in-cheek, as Jack will know, in Hamilton you do, right? You've got a mountain, so you've got to pay attention to that. That may not be the case in Perth County, where you're not looking at major water courses or lakes or whatever. So again, we would work if we were asked to do this. We would work with staff to come up with a set of principles that match your municipality's needs. That's a long answer to a short question, sorry.
Thanks. Jack, anything on this one?
Just, I mean, reiterating what Bob said, but even then, when the guiding principles are established, the uniqueness, the public, it relates to the public engagement question that came up earlier. That's a really big part of identifying which guiding principles are then prioritized is part of this process, is hearing from the public, hearing from council as well, and helping us to identify, is this a place that's really prioritizing population, or is this a place that's really prioritizing something like communities of interest? So even when the guiding principles themselves are defined, prioritizing them helps us understand the municipality better as well.
And probably the best one in there, if I could very quickly, Mr. Mayor, one of the main ones in some communities is future growth. That's a set of principles that doesn't apply at the federal level. But for many municipalities, we're being asked to consider, where is the population going to be in 3 elections? And we will often come up with preliminary options and say, okay, and you may have not looked at it in 20 years. Here's what you do to get to parity today, and we'll let the future take care of itself. And others will say, okay, let's fix it now so that when we go out those 3 elections, we're still going to be balanced. And that again is what is Jack's getting at. Which of those becomes most important? And they often find their way into the options that we present to the community to say, if you want future growth, it's going to look like this. If you want to just catch up, it might look like that. If you want to look at communities, it might look like something else, slightly different. So they all go into it. What they are and how they're weighted is part of what we would do as part of a review.
Thanks, gentlemen. The reason it had invited brevity is because it's swelteringly hot in the council chamber.
Oh.
Kirk and I are melting. So we think maybe we fixed the air conditioning in this room, but it certainly is increasing our irritability. Councillor Burns, second question, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Kasenberg. I apologize. I'm sitting in an air-conditioned environment, so I don't feel the heat quite like what you do. I was going to question why it would be staff that would be doing the prioritizing of the guiding principles instead of the actual council, but that is not my second question. I would hope that the council would have some input into what those guiding principles would be. That's just simply a comment. The other thing is going back to the historic and realizing that, yeah, we only talk about the ward boundaries at election. That could propose that perhaps the system currently is working, but it has been over 20 years, and it's time to take a second look to see if something better could be developed. I'm curious, you have mentioned that you have been potentially in front of LPAT to defend decisions. Have any gone back to the amalgamation orders themselves? Because unfortunately, a lot of the information on the newly developed municipality and the council size and everything else, unfortunately, in some instances, was written directly into the amalgamation order. Have some people been challenging the ability to change based on that? That's my question.
I would have to say I'm not aware that there have been appeals or reviews based on the amalgamation order itself. Maybe I'm not getting the question right. We are having some interesting discussions in Simcoe County around the original legislation for some of the reforms and whether features of the Municipal Act now override those. But amalgamation orders, I don't recall having any discussions about that being the core part of a review. There was one exception, bear with me, Mr. Mayor, where a decision made by the OMB, and Jack alluded to it earlier, in Caledon made a very specific set of recommendations that essentially said, we're not paying any attention to population, we're doing X. And that's part of what our current debate is. Is it still relevant today? But that's about as close as it comes to any kind of going back to the historic origins of a particular municipality. So, I don't believe that that has been the case. Our assumption is you were set up, certain arrangements were put in place, and that after that, the Municipal Act kicks in. And if you need to make some changes, that's what you turn to, the Municipal Act, and that's partly what we're working under here.
Yeah, I would agree. Nothing comes to mind, and we've worked in so many places dealing specifically with pre-amalgamation boundaries. And again, this is not conclusive, but I feel like if it would have been an issue somewhere, that we would have heard of it by now. But again, that's by no means, it may have been, but yeah, not off top of mind.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I will sort of follow up on Councillor Barron's comment, which I think is a useful one. You did focus a lot on staff, and I would like to see if there's a reason why council wouldn't be involved in establishing the guiding principles and practices for your efforts.
Yeah, no, I can address that one quickly, and Bob, jump in if you have something else to add. Definitely, when guiding principles have been established with other municipal clients we've worked with, again, I don't know if it's always been a council staff collaboration, but I know for sure that there have been guiding principles established for us that have come from council and staff discussions or motions. So I would not say that it has to be staff or it has to be council. We've worked with municipalities that have done both. And also in terms of that prioritization comment, just so we're clear, the prioritization of the guiding principles, not from staff or council, and we want to be clear about that. The prioritization of the guiding principles, we want that to come from the community, either from our experiences and what we hear and the research we do, or the community itself. And that's something that's important, really inherent in this process. Is one thing we never, not we, but you as the council, don't want to be accused of a process where there's gerrymandering, right? We ensure that there's arm's length from council. So we talk to council. We want an understanding of the municipality and the unique issues that North Perth are facing, and that's what we want to hear from council. If there's something we got really wrong, like drawing a line right through a major community, those are the types of things we need to hear about. But what we usually, tell staff and council is what we don't want is, and we've gotten this before, but we don't want to get a map back from council saying, well, where's the line should go. And especially, what we've gotten in the past is a line or a drawing from a particular councillor saying, this is how my ward should look like. Because obviously, if you ever got appealed, and that's a decision that council made, chances are you're going to lose that appeal. So we want to be careful that the process is grounded in that arm's length approach.
And if I may, Mr. Mayor, let's go back to that idea of where the guiding principles come from. Very often, if we are responding either to an RFP or in some cases to a sole source, it's often in response to a report that a clerk has presented to council to basically launch the project. And that often does include some guiding principles that the clerk has put into that document that we then turn back to and say, okay, here's the council approved guiding principles. That's what we will work with. Where clerks get that, I can tease clerks about this. It's a matter of you beg, borrow, and steal sometimes. Oh, here's some terms of reference or guiding principles from X or Y municipality. They look good, so you blend those together and come up with your own. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we have to learn from each other, but then that is taken to council as a launch into the project. And then when we come along, basically it's here's the principles that council has approved for this municipality. If it's not quite as rigid a process of awarding a contract, we could be happily working with staff to make some suggestions about that. But in the end, it's council and through recommendations from staff that that would drive the principles, the list of principles that would be used in a review.
Thank you. I have one further factual question myself. Earlier during our April 26th discussion, the question was raised about some sort of hybrid system wherein we could have a few who were elected at large beyond mayor and deputy mayor and a few who were elected in wards. And I think the question that was posed at the time is, does Ontario allow that?
Short answer is yes. The other response to is, what would be the what difference would you expect to come out of that kind of an arrangement? What would an at-large councillor do that's different than a ward councillor? Because under the Act, a councillor is a councillor is a councillor. So making that arrangement, and I can see where some places would like to have, and we heard this in very early on, people with that broad municipal-wide perspective. Okay, now that you got them, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to use them in a different way than another councillor? Are you going to pay them differently? Or what would be the outcome of that for the operation of your council? Again, thinking through, what would we gain by that? What do we want to gain by that? And you know, what would be the differences between the two? If that's my initial response. So the short answer, yes, you can do that. You can have a combination.
Okay, thank you. I think that sort of brings us to the end of our fact collecting. You got a few opinions as well, and I may route back to you to ask you to summarize a few things going forward. But let me just proceed with what I think is a rational process here. Council, you may have taken note that the clerk's recommendation is to the effect that we engage, or we invite the engagement, first through a proposal, of course, of Watson and Associates to conduct a review of the North Perth electoral process. So, you know, there's a recommendation from the clerk. You've heard tonight a fulsome discussion, I think, with regards to facts and even some opinions at this point. What I'd like to do is straw vote this just to sort of understand where we sit at this point. So what I'm going to ask is, any councillor who is opposed to inviting Watson and Associates to prepare a proposal that we may consider as a council for the review of this process, if you're opposed, I'd like to know that at this point. Okay, sure. Councillor Behrens, you have a question?
Yes, it's not clear in the actual motion when we're talking about the electoral process. Are we talking both the wards and the council composition, like the number of councillors, or are we simply talking the ward system? Like I'm just asking.
Thanks. Clerk Berfeltz actually has just pointed at her chest and said, you have to tell me. So I think the invitation is from this council to determine the course of action, whether we want to engage them on the basis of just ward boundary work, or whether we want to engage them somewhat more broadly and invite their contributions to the issue of council composition and count and so forth. So I think there's the motion is vague, and I'm just trying to get a sense of whether there's strong opposition to proceeding down that path. If we want to proceed down that path, we can talk about the details when we actually get to a real resolution. Councillor Rothwell, you have a question as well?
Yes, thanks, Mayor Todd. Just a question through to staff regarding our procurement procedures. Like, is this a situation where it's we're just inviting one firm, Watson Associates, to provide this information, or are we going to ask additional firms? Just need to hear that. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Rothwell. I certainly asked that question too. CAO Snell, would you like to respond?
So as I mentioned earlier, certainly that's at the discretion of council. Council does have the sole right to single source. We certainly did reach out to look to sort of scan the field for people who could help us with tonight's presentation, and certainly Watson's were more than willing to participate. Council, I think, could move ahead on a single source, knowing that Watson's has done a lot of work in Perth County and background on the official plan, so would have some knowledge on our growth, or they could, in fact, go to an RFP if they so chose to.
So in response to the CAO's comments, maybe the first straw vote should be, should we engage consultants to help us with this? Is anyone opposed to the idea of engaging consultants to help us with this? Okay, so straw vote says no, there's not an objection at this point, at least as far as I can see, to engaging consultants, and that the implication is that council feels that this is the time we should do this in some way, shape, or form. So the next question to Councillor Rothwell's question then is, and maybe we don't need to answer that question immediately, but certainly Watson has credentials and they've availed themselves to us tonight for the purpose of this discussion. You know, should we invite them on a sole source basis, or should we open this up to public RFP? Those are both reasonable and valid choices at this point. I'm interested in council's comments. Who would like to offer comment on this? Anyone have strong feelings about this? Okay, Councillor Richardson, please.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Kasenberg, I would just like to make mention that I do believe that this would be okay for single sourcing, just given the level of professionalism and the background information that these gentlemen have with the county, and I would certainly like to hear more from them going forward with the report. So I'm okay with single sourcing. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have an opposing view like that heard? Okay. Okay, so the treasurer has made a comment, and perhaps we should hear from the treasurer. Ms. Hale, did you want to join us? Offer your comment?
Thank you very much. I think, as was mentioned, council having the opportunity to single source, I would suggest, though, that it might be a good idea to actually do a detailed parameters of what you were hoping that the consultants would be achieving for you. And secondly, getting a cost estimate from them before single sourcing them at this time.
Okay, so the clerk is saying that a report could be brought forward at the next council meeting to that end, and council could make a decision whether it wishes to award on a single source basis or whether it wishes to open to a broader field. Councillor Rothwell, you have a comment?
Nothing further. I certainly appreciate Francis Hale's comments from a finance standpoint. I would certainly agree on that basis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, council, any other opposing views to this request, which is to ask for something of a proposal with cost estimate from Watson at this time? This is straw vote. This is not formal vote. We'll deal with the formal resolution a little bit later. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone, so it seems like, oh, Councillor Barnes, please. Yeah.
So I'm a little bit confused now. Perhaps we just talk too long. We are them to prepare a proposal, and with the proposal, I would expect that there would be a cost estimate. But backtracking a bit, we've agreed to single source. So I'm just slightly confused as to what we're actually asking for at this time, because Francis Hale had said, to make sure we know what we're getting and a cost estimate, but we haven't had the conversation about what we want. So to me, it would be unfair to ask them for a cost estimate. So I'm just wondering if, do we go away, regroup, think about, or could they give us a list of things that we want and we can get back to them? Or I'm just concerned about doing this so quickly. We're not sure what we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks. What I've done so far is sort of straw poll this. So my intention was to just get a sentiment at this point. I think what I was thinking after the sentiment, Councillor Cairns, is that we would talk about the nitty gritty a little bit more before we end this meeting tonight. And that would then allow us to consider a reasonable resolution, whether it's to single source this, whether it's to create an RFP. Those are options that I think lie ahead. But I thought perhaps we would just sort of get a sense of whether we believe a consultant should be brought in at this point, and what the sentiment was regarding sole sourcing, which it can go either way depending on what lies ahead. So perhaps what we do now is we move forward with a little bit more discussion about what we think some of the key aspects of this work would be for any consultant that we would engage. We've had a significant conversation already so far tonight. So I just want to check in with councillors to see what things would you like addressed in the scope of work from a consultant, whether we decide to single source or whether we put it out to RFP at this point in time. And maybe what we can do is just go around the table to see whether there's comments added to the list, if you will, of things that we would want explored. So why don't I start, maybe Councillor Behrens, why don't we start with you on that front? To explore in a scope of work, what would you like the consultant to do?
Well, unfortunately, Mayor Kasemberg, I don't have enough information to know that. I have not seen any other documents that they prepared for other municipalities. I don't have the knowledge base really right now to know what I want to ask for. So I'm at a loss to even answer the question. Thanks.
Okay. Councillor Duncan, do you have any impressions of what you'd like to hear about?
I'm somewhat not sure at this point either. We've talked about quite a bit of different stuff here tonight. Like, I would like to see I guess, council composition and ward boundary adjustments are the two things that I think we're talking about here tonight. So those are the two things I would like to see if we're going to go forward using a consultant.
Thanks, Matt. Actually, given the first two responses to the question, maybe it was a bad question and approach that I've come up with. So let me regroup with this as a potential option. Let me direct to Jack and Bob. If we asked you for a menu of services that you could provide that would support our core objective, which is council composition and ward boundary review adjustments, perhaps even the sort of electoral process, because I think that's what the resolution calls for. Do you think you'd be able to turn us over a list with, brief explanations of here's what you can do, here's how we do it?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I was actually going to jump in and suggest that maybe we can help clarify some of the questions. So absolutely, what we would provide to you would be a proposal that would outline all the services all the deliverables, all the services, from public engagement to surveys to options to meetings, council meetings, basically outline the entire process for you. And we can even do that to make your decision a little bit easier so you don't have to decide tonight. We can basically give you the proposal that includes the council composition and ward boundary review, and also give you the option B, which would just be the ward boundary review if you didn't want to entertain council composition. So we've done that many times basically given municipalities the full proposal, and they have the option to choose which one they want to go with. So it sounds like that is probably what you and your council need to see in front of you is those actual list of deliverables, what the process would entail, what Watson would be and Dr. Williams would be responsible for, and associated component costs for everything as well.
Okay, so we think that that's what the CAO is referring to in his approach to this resolution as well. You know, for me, with respect, gentlemen, I'd like to keep this at the sort of 2,000 foot level above the ground. You know, like I don't want to send you a mandate to prepare a 50, 60, 70 page document for us, when in fact, really what we need is like a wish book, you know? Do you understand my concept here? Something just here's what can happen. Here's the services that can be available. I don't want you to knock yourselves out at this point, because I think council has to make some decisions from that basis before we decide to ask formally for cost this. These are the things we want. But maybe I'm wrong. If councillors disagree, please let me know. Councillor Richardson?
Thank you. Through you again. I would think that an executive summary of what the services that can be provided and deliverables. My question is there an example of a report that you have created, like even with redacted sections or whatever, that's not relative to North Perth at all, just to show that the level of information that can be provided? Is that something that can be done, even if it's from a totally different, obviously be a different municipality, but just something to reference, like how deep into the weeds do you really get in this?
Yeah, there's many examples of council composition and ward boundary reviews and solo ward boundary reviews. So maybe the best thing to do is I can email the clerk a list of the municipalities we've worked for. They're all public documents. So there's nothing that has to be redacted, or basically they're all available online, whether you want to look at some historic from a couple of elections ago, or ones that we're working on now. And even something that comes to mind, Trent Hills, their options and preliminary options, as well as final recommendations is one that you can look at. A fairly small to mid-sized municipality. We looked at, they had, I think, and Bob, we've done so many, my memory fails me sometimes, but I think they originally had 3 wards, a 3-2-1 councillor setup. They looked at deputy mayor that was elected or selected from council at the time. They moved to electing. So it might be a good one for council to look at, because it really touched on many of the topics that we're talking about today. In addition, Bradford West Gwillimbury is one that we're actually presenting to council tomorrow night. But if you want to get a sense of what the preliminary options report looks like, that would be a good one that's available online right now as well. And again, similar issues looked at council size, deputy mayor, and ward boundary reconfiguration. So those are 2 that, you know, right now you can go and Google and check out. But like I said, I'll send a more comprehensive list to the clerk, and then she can provide that to the councillors.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm hoping that my comments are reasonably understood. I don't feel that we should put you through the paces of developing a deep proposal at this point. I think what we want is sort of a landscape of options. What can we do? So I'm hoping that that's what you understand from my comments, at least, is that I think that would be the better approach. That way, you know, we can literally look at it as a menu, pick from the menu the things that we think look good and tasty, and send that back to you and say, let's have a full proposal that you can cost this with our understanding. Does that make sense, gentlemen?
Yeah. I mean, if that's what you're looking for, that is completely reasonable. I would say to that, from our end, from a resource point of view, it is not. It would not be super labor intensive to provide you, even with the. I think what you're gonna get from us, whether it's the full proposal or the menu, is probably gonna look fairly similar, but we can definitely cater it to specifically what you're looking for.
Okay, and I think part of the reason for that is that I'm not sure the council has made a decision about single sourcing this at this point. So what we don't necessarily want is for you to betray your pricing structure in the public domain without a clear understanding of what could happen with that.
Yeah, and we're pretty, yeah, and I would say we're well versed in that. And as a firm, we don't take issue with providing you a proposal under this discussion that we're talking about. And should you decide to go another way, there's nothing beholden to that or to that price structure. So that's understood from our end. Yes.
Okay, very good. Council, do you have any further questions about this option? Because I'm starting to see a resolution jump off the page at me here that might work. CEO Snell, do you have any comments before we try to finesse a resolution here?
No, I think council is certainly massage sort of the right scope, and I think we once we receive that information from Watson Associates, staff can prepare a report back to council.
Okay, thank you. So council, I'm going to float a real resolution past you at this point, and we'll look for wordsmithing as usual. It's a revision to that which was found in the staff report. It reads as follows: that the Council of the Municipality of North Perth invite Watson and Associate Economists Limited to prepare a summary of options for a review of the North Perth electoral process, including ward boundary, or ward boundaries, I guess I should say, and council composition options. Anyone have suggestions for improving that? Does that sound pretty good? Okay, so we're not seeing any expression of anything there. So Councillor Behrens, could I call on you to be the mover?
Sure.
And Councillor Duncan, you'll serve as our seconder?
Certainly will.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a motion on the floor then. I hope council understands it. Are there any questions about this motion before we put it to a vote? This is not a straw vote. This is a real vote. All right. So are there any opposed? Okay, Councillor Richardson, do you have a question?
No, that was from before. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. The clerk was just making sure. Okay, so are there any opposed? Please indicate no in the chat function. So we're not seeing anything. That is carried. Thank you. That means a gentleman from Watson, with your consent and kindness, we would look forward to this summary of options for us in accord with some of the things you've heard us talk about.
Thank you, and absolutely.
Delighted. Thank you. All right. That, I think, brings to a close our discussion this evening. I'm sure the hockey fans would appreciate if I just move this on. So let's have a look here. I think that's council direction. That'll serve as council direction in this matter. We expect that staff will bring forward a report, including the response from Watson. All right, so let's move to item 6 on our agenda. We have the confirmatory bylaw for this meeting, just because there were lots of things that were covered and we figured we just better make sure. So can I call on Deputy Mayor Kellum to serve as our mover for the confirmatory bylaw?
Yes, I'll make that motion.
Thank you. And can I call on Councillor Richardson to be our seconder?
I will second that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any discussion or debate? Seeing none, are there any opposed? Okay, we're not seeing any opposed. Council, before we adjourn, is there anything urgent on your minds? Things that we should have covered or didn't get to? Okay, we're not seeing anything, so I have a motion for adjournment. It reads as follows: that the council meeting adjourns at 8:59 p.m. to meet for general council business on Monday, June 7th, 2021. Councillor Rothwell, will you serve as our mover for that one?
I so move.
And Councillor Seiler, will you be our seconder?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any opposed? And I'm not seeing any, so we'll call that carried, and this meeting thus is adjourned. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thanks for gathering with us.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.